Greetings, everybody. It's your man Akil back again. And based on the advice I've been getting from some acquaintances of mine for some time now, I'm going to try and start doing these videos more regularly. I'm going to be posting one video per week, whether it's a standalone video or one of these interviews, such as the one I'm doing right now. In my efforts to do videos that are as timely as possible, a great topic for me to address right now would be the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. It just so happens I recently made a new acquaintance, a new friend, who hails from that lovely yet currently tormented country. His name's Jorge, and he today is going to shed some light on that crisis in Venezuela for us based on personal experience. Jorge, so glad you could join us.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So, Jorge, why don't we just start by getting some background on you?
I'm from Venezuela, of course. I'm a student in Venezuela who came to the United States because of the current situation my country faces. My country is in a dictatorship right now, so I was the president of the youth of a political party there. Because of that, because of how insecure it was, I moved to the United States to study, to do my major in economics and business, and to do my master's. And I will come back to Venezuela afterwards. I will be traveling a few universities this summer to speak about the situation my country faces today. I'm just basically a student, as everyone in my country who wants a change, who want a democracy, and truly want justice and peace in my country.
Tell us a little bit more in detail about your experiences in Venezuelan politics and exactly how you came to be involved in it.
I was very young when I became involved in politics. I was 16 years old. I'm 20 right now, and I became very involved because I saw the pain in the eyes of my people. I saw the pain in the eyes of my parents every time we saw injustice and every time we saw that this dictatorship was taking over the power of our entire country. This dictatorship that basically tries to control the life of every single one of us, the censorship media that is basically killing freedom of speech and every type of freedom. That's why I became involved in politics, because I saw the pain in the eyes of every single one of my compatriots.
How did you exactly get your foot in that door? Was it difficult or dangerous for you to get involved from the beginning?
At the beginning, it's always difficult. I was very young, as I said. I became involved with Voluntad Popular, who is the political party of Leopoldo Lopez. I became a member, I became an activist, and then I was elected as like the youth president of the political party in my city. I became more and more vocal. At this moment, I have more than 100,000 followers on Twitter. It's very dangerous when you are there and you have a government, a dictatorship, that tries to censor you, that tries to incarcerate you, and that puts in jail every single one of us who dream with a better Venezuela. When Leopoldo Lopez was protesting and the government just put him in jail, we knew that difficult times were coming. We knew that we need to fight as hard as possible. But for me, it was better to come here, to prepare myself, to study, and then I will come back to Venezuela after I do my degree and my master's. When I come to the university, to FAU in Florida, I try to be as vocal as possible. I was a spokesman of the Venezuelan International Alliance. I was a spokesman of the Latin American Student Association. I became involved with the student government when I was a congressman. I was the chief advisor of the Speaker of the House, and I ran for governor as well. So I'm trying to be really an activist. I'm trying to fight for students and for a cause, because I think if you are young and you don't believe in freedom, you are not just young. You need to be rebel. You need to fight for your freedom, and you need to fight for all the things that we respect.
So I get the impression that part of the reason you decided to study in the States was because of some pressures that were involved with your activism in Venezuela. Whatever you're at liberty to share with us about that pressure that you faced, we'd love to hear about.
Every single one of the students who's fighting for a better Venezuela is receiving a lot of pressure from the dictatorship. I have a lot of friends who've been in jail. I have a lot of friends who've been basically kidnapped by the dictatorship. And that's what we are facing right now. We are facing a brutal repression. And that's why I'm here, because the world needs to know what is happening in Venezuela. And when I go to this university and I speak about the issues, they clearly don't know the severity of the situation, of the brutal repression. And as I said, I had pressure when I was in Venezuela, but same as me, every single one of the students who are fighting for it, the thousands and thousands of students who are every single day on the streets protesting have the same pressures.
So why don't you tell us a bit about the background of the crisis in Venezuela itself? Because when we met, I know that you were able to tell me a lot about the history of Venezuelan politics and how first Chavez and later Maduro were able to come to power. So why don't you give us some of that background?
Yeah, basically Venezuela was a very prosperous country until the 70s. Until the 70s, Venezuela was a prosperous country with economic freedom, with political freedom, and was an example of a democracy. The thing is that after political instability, after irresponsible governments, Chavez was elected into office in 1998. Then was the real progress began because he changed the constitution. He basically brought the rule of law, and he basically started nationalizing, confiscating all the private sectors of the economy. More than 1,200 private entities were nationalized, and basically almost all media were nationalized. And basically when you kill the industry, when you kill the private sector, when you try to fight against entrepreneurship, that's what happens in the country. Most people refer to the declining oil prices, but I don't believe that's the main issue. That was, of course, an issue. But the main issue is that when you have a government with policies against all entrepreneurship, with policies against the rule of the free market, you start having these type of issues. And right now, Venezuelans don't have jobs, Venezuelans don't have opportunities, and Venezuelans don't have a future because of these policies that have been counterproductive for the economy, counterproductive for the future of all Venezuelans.
It's interesting because, like I mentioned when we first met, I remember years ago reading an old issue of National Geographic from back in the 1970s. And I remember it was all about how relatively prosperous a country Venezuela was. It chalked up a lot of that prosperity, maybe the lion's share of it, to the country's oil reserves. But there seemed to be some public policy dimension to that prosperity as well, as one, I think, would expect. So what were the kinds of policies that Venezuela had back in those days that enabled it to be so prosperous compared to what it has today?
Venezuela until the 70s was the fifth most free country in the world. Venezuela's GDP was only 13% down than the United Kingdom. When you see a country as free as Venezuela was, with a huge influx of immigrants from all over the world, especially from Europe, you saw a country who was prosperous. You saw a country who was really improving every single year. On the contrast with Chavez, you saw, for example, artificially fixed exchange rate since 2003, who has been incredible harm to our economy, because it's killing our exportations, it's killing our national industries as well. Another example is all the laws that Chavez passed against private property. That was, of course, very bad for all entrepreneurs and was prejudicial and detrimental for the private sector. That was two clear policies that were incredibly bad for the economy. If I can mention another one, it will be the contest problem with inflation. The devaluation of our currency has been detrimental. We have the highest inflation rate in the world. We have the highest devaluation of a country in the world. And that's really an issue, because when you don't have monetary stability, you don't have any economic stability as well.
Right. So I understand. From what I've heard, Venezuela is in an even worse position than Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, and that's saying a hell of a lot. What can you tell us about Venezuelan politics? Because I've read recently, especially since last November's election in the United States and the election of Donald Trump as president, I actually remember reading an article that drew parallels between Donald Trump and Hugo Chavez. And no, it wasn't ideological per se, but it was that they were both demagogues and that they both used somewhat similar tactics in engaging in demagoguery. And their opponents, their political opponents in both countries, the US and Venezuela, made similar mistakes in trying to combat that demagoguery, mistakes that made them seem out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reason that each one was able to win power. Does that ring true at all, given your experience in Venezuelan politics?
Basically, something that Donald Trump and Chavez have in common is an authoritarian perspective of politics. Chavez was authoritarian in every sense of the word. For example, Chavez was basically the entire state, the entire government. After the reform in the constitution, Chavez basically had all the power, not only the political power, as well as the economic power, and due that the executive branch has the control of the oil industry. In Venezuela, for example, since 2000 and 2008, more than $260,000 billion were received in oil revenues. So politically wise, something that they have in common is this authoritarian perspective of politics. There is really not the democratic and liberal type of policies that we want to implement. We really want to have a consent, we really want to have a consensus from all political parties, from all political ideologies, in order to govern for everyone. In Venezuela, it's not like that. In Venezuela, you have a government that from day one was trying to govern just for a small few and rejecting the vast majority of Venezuelans who want a different type of country. And of course, Chavez won in 1998, but the abstention was huge as well. So something that we need to understand is that for a country to develop and a country to really improve every single year, we need to have policies that represent every sector of the population. We need to have policies that represent every single one of us, because that's the only way that we can have a healthy democracy, we can have a healthy country. And yeah, if you ask me what they have in common, is that it's an authoritarian perspective of politics.
That is so interesting, and I'm so glad to hear you say it, because I think that's a key element in the political struggle against leaders like Chavez and, frankly, Donald Trump. They often seem to come to power because their predecessors do implement policies that are frequently unjust in various ways. Now, when they come to power, they make things even worse on the whole. But all too often, they're only able to come to power in the first place because their predecessors really are governing for the benefit of a select few at the expense of the many. And that gives these demagogues with these authoritarian political instincts issues that they can exploit in order to come to power. For example, from what I understand in Venezuela, Chavez, a lot of his early popularity stemmed from the perception that he really was governing on behalf of and in favor of the poor of Venezuela, who really were getting a raw deal in at least some respects before he came to power. And they formed his power base for pretty much or almost all of his time in office. So where would you say a lot of the folks in Venezuela at the lower end of the income distribution are right now? Are they still staying loyal to Chavez's successor, Maduro, or are they finally starting to get fed up with the ongoing crisis and turn against the regime as well?
90% of Venezuelans are against this regime, because right now we are not fighting a political battle. We're fighting a social battle, because we're fighting a government who are putting people to starve. Right now we live in a country where people starve to death. Right now we have a country in which people see their brothers being killed because of how insecure Venezuela is. Venezuela is the most insecure country in the world, even more than African countries, even more than Honduras, for example. A country like Venezuela, it's impossible that people remain with the Maduro regime, because no one is having a good life in Venezuela. We used to say that the poor were benefiting for the Chavez administration, but in fact, it was just a result of how high the oil revenues was. But we were not creating the basis of a solid, sustainable economic development of the country. Right now, at this moment, you see people starving to death. You see people having real problems. And the crisis right now in Venezuela is a social crisis, not only a political crisis. That's why you see people fighting in the streets. That's why you see people protesting every single day. Because when you don't have anything to eat, when you don't have security, when you don't have freedom, you really need to fight. And that's why 9 out of 10 people in Venezuela are against this regime.
I think the logical next question is, what can be done about it? What hope do you see for, I suppose at this point actually for some time now, I would say we could safely hope for the end of the Maduro regime, but do you think that can happen internally just based on the efforts of Venezuelans themselves? Or do you think things are eventually going to come to a pass where the outside world has to intervene? And if so, how do you think that might play out?
First of all, we Venezuelans, we will defeat this regime. In Venezuela, this regime will collapse. It's unsustainable. It's really impossible to maintain this type of regime with just repression. And I'm optimistic because we are fighting every single day for that. It has been more than 5 weeks now in which we have been fighting on the streets every single day. And of course, the repression is brutal, but we have been brave enough to fight every single day despite the repression. Now, in your question about the international community, it is fundamental that we internationally make pressure. It is fundamental that we create international awareness. It is fundamental that we live in countries as free and democratic as the United States, because this freedom empowers us to defend democracy, not only domestically, but overseas. And we have that duty as citizens. We have that duty as human beings, because when we see what is happening in Venezuela, we need to really help. And just answering your questions, Venezuela will change. The change is coming. I have zero doubts about it. But as well, we need to do our part here internationally.
On that point, what kind of pressure specifically do you think the international community should bring to bear on the Maduro regime? Do you think, for example, economic sanctions might be called for? Because my understanding is those often harm the people they aim to help, because the regime in power tends to respond to them by making sure that the impact falls on the most vulnerable people in the country and on their political opponents. And frankly, that's probably likely to happen anyway, naturally on its own. So do you think sanctions are an option, or are other policy tools preferable?
What is preferable right now is that we have all nations coming together to be vocal and to create awareness about the situation and to really help the people in Venezuela. There are several ways in which you can help. You can really support the political parties. You can really support the protesters. You can really support the students there. But I don't think sanctions is the right thing to do. I think what we need to do is to really protect and to be vocal about what is happening in Venezuela. Organizations as the United Nations, organizations as the Organization of American States, they are doing their part. They need to keep the pressure. They need to keep pushing. And that's what we need to do internationally, create awareness. But sanctions, I don't think that's a good idea, because what we need to do is to fight internally what is happening in Venezuela.
You're actually not the first person I've met who's from Venezuela. I actually had a couple of acquaintances in university who were also from Venezuela. Neither of them still lives there. They were both in their own way critical of the Chavez regime. And I remember one of them had a pretty conservative political outlook overall. And I remember at one point about 11 years ago, hearing him say that he would not have been averse to seeing some sort of coup d'etat, US sponsored if need be, to overthrow Chavez. And I remember thinking, I was very leery of that proposal for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was that I feared it could make a bad situation even worse. It actually harkened back to the abortive coup d'etat against Chavez in 2002. I remember when that happened, I was actually on a visit to Trinidad not long after. What I remember hearing from my relatives who would follow Venezuelan politics to some degree was that you had a lot of supporters of Chavez in the population come out on the streets at the time and demonstrate in support of his presidency. And that's one of the ways he was able to return to power. And given the history of US intervention throughout Latin America, for the US to intervene would really probably do more harm than good. And even just on a strategic level, not even taking all the moral issues into account. So I guess what I'm wondering is, in the past, you have had some leaders in Latin America who've taken a very leftist turn, similar to Chavez's rule and Maduro's rule in many respects, who ultimately were unseated by some sort of US intervention or US-backed intervention, such as Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. And to take the example of Chile, you had Augusto Pinochet come to power afterwards, remain in power for the next, I guess it was 13 years or so. He implemented a lot of free market reforms from which the Chilean economy benefited, but he was a dictatorship and he did commit a lot of human rights violations and kill a lot of innocent people in order to stay in power. From my perspective, as a supporter of free market economics in principle, but at the same time who considers himself very anti-imperialist, I've always had a hard time giving the Pinochet regime any kind of props, if you will, for the economic policies he implemented, given the way that he was able to implement them and just get any domestic political opposition out of the way. And of course, to this day, free market economists still have a bad name in many quarters, partly because of that. It's sort of a millstone that's hung around our necks. So what's your take on that whole issue? Do you think that it may be worth it if, for example, someone of Pinochet's ilk were to come to power in Venezuela after Maduro and implement the necessary economic reforms in a political manner similar to Pinochet's?
The transition that will happen in Venezuela must be constitutional, must be democratic, and must be from the people. I reject any other type of transition. We need to really have a transition from this type of regime into a democratic, into a new type of government that will represent all Venezuelans. Dictatorship is never desirable. A dictatorship will never happen in Venezuela again, and that's what we are fighting for. Any dictatorship is not desirable. Not even a right-wing or a left-wing dictatorship. We need to have a government that represents every single one of us. That's why I will never condone a dictatorship. and that what will happen in Venezuela is that we will have a peaceful, a democratic, a constitutional transition, and that's what we need to do. We really need to have this type of transition in order to have a sustainable democracy, healthy and strong democracy over time.
Good, good. I'm very glad to hear you say that. That's exactly my feeling on that subject too. I suppose one question I have when it comes to policy is, what are some specific examples of policies that were implemented in Venezuela before Chavez ever came to power that were unjust in the sense that they benefited only the more privileged few at the expense of the many, thus enabling Chavez to come to power in the first place? Because I remember you said his predecessors weren't governing in the interest of the whole society. So what are some of the things that they did wrong on a policy level, and how can Maduro's successor correct those mistakes?
Before Chavez, there was already a huge interventionist environment in Venezuela. The governments before Chavez, the governments of Carlos Andrés Pérez or the governments of Rafael Caldera, were highly interventionist in the economy, with price caps, with fixed exchange rates, with really, really rigid labor laws as well. And those type of policies really became the engine that made Chavez got elected into office in 1988. Because before Chavez, there was a huge discontent with the government. There was a huge discontent with the current at the time, bipartisan political system. Both political parties were highly interventionist. And as I said, since the 70s until the 90s, before Chavez, there was policies that were highly interventionist. And that's what we need to change. We need to have a government that do not interfere with the economy. We need to have a government that let entrepreneurs do their job, that let the private sector create prosperity. If we have this type of responsible, mature government, we can grow as a country. We need to really have huge reforms in all areas of the economy. We need to have a deep, comprehensive reform in labor laws. We need to have a deep, comprehensive reform in terms of private property, in which we will give back freedom to our citizens. We need to empower them. We need to really create an environment that is pro-business, pro-investment. And if we have that, if we have a government that is responsible, and we have a government that do not interfere with the private sector, we can have prosperity for our people. We can have opportunities for our people. And that will be the only way to never repeat the same sin that we committed when we got Chavez elected into office. Because if we create this prosperity, if we create opportunities for our people, they will understand the type of government that we will have in Venezuela and that we should have in Venezuela. And that's why I'm saying to you that Chavez was a direct result of all these interventionist policies that were made before Chavez. And that for we never repeat the same mistakes, we need to have a responsible government when we change and when we have a transition, peaceful, democratic, and constitutional transition from the Maduro regime to this new type of democratic government.
I hear you loud and clear. One of the frustrating things about believing in limited government and free markets is that very often governments intervene in the economy, sometimes with the best of intentions, inadvertently screw things up, create problems. They actually do more harm than good. And then what happens? Those problems are then blamed on the capitalist system, even though it was government intervention that really caused them. And those problems are then used as a justification for further government interventions that screw things up even more. And at every step of the way, the negative unintended consequences are blamed on capitalism, even though they're usually more properly understood the fault of crony capitalism and state capitalism. So, I definitely sympathize with you on that front. Now, you mentioned to me earlier that you hope to return to Venezuela and contribute to the country's politics and to reform there. What if, despite the intensity of the current crisis, things don't improve and Maduro is not removed from power before you graduate, get your degree, and your international student visa expires and you may have to return home? Will you even be able to return home safely? What are the odds?
Things will change in Venezuela. I'm highly optimistic about the situation because of the protests, because of the pressure, because the environment in Venezuela is not sustainable in the long run. And if we have that scenario, which I don't believe we will have, because the change is coming, the change will come this year, I will still come back to Venezuela and I will do anything that is in my hands to really make a change in Venezuela. I made a promise to my family, to my friends, to every single one there, that I will come back and I will devote my life to my people. And I think that will be the only thing that will really make me happy and will really think that my life was worth it. I really believe that Venezuela will change, that the transition is coming sooner than later. And the pressure that we're seeing on the streets will really create a transition in Venezuela. And when I come back to Venezuela, I aspire that we can have a government that represents every single one of my compatriots. I really think that we'll build this government that everyone will be proud of, a government that will represent every political view, every ideology. And with that, we are responsible, limited, small government. We will have a country that will be prosperous again, that will create opportunities again, and that will give to every single one of my compatriots the ability to build their lives with freedom, with happiness, and with opportunities. And that's the way I'll come back to Venezuela, because it's our duty as citizens and it's our duty as a generation to fight for our country, because otherwise everything will be over. But I think the sacrifices that our generation will make will really help to make my country prosperous one more time.
Music to my ears. I could not possibly agree more. And I wish you and your family and friends, and ultimately all the people of Venezuela, all the best, all the luck in the world that they haven't had for so long. And I do pray for that peaceful, democratic, and the classically liberal transition of which the country is in such great need. From what I understand, it's a beautiful country with a beautiful history and culture. Beautiful. And it's about high time that it had a government along those lines as well, the kind of regime that it really deserves. Thanks so much for joining me today, Jorge. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to having further discussions with you in the future as things progress down there and elsewhere.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the invitation. I really appreciate that you are concerned about the situation in my country. And if we have people that are smart and intelligent as you, really fighting for a cause, I'm sure everything will be fine in my country. So that's why I'm grateful, I'm honored, and thank you very much, my friend.
My pleasure. Thanks so much again. Signing off.